It's a great pleasure to be here. Just a warning, I'm not a retired official. So the organizers asked me to talk about the central bank of the future. Well, predicting the future is extremely difficult. Ask Willem Middelkoop. Yeah? And predicting the future of central banking is even more, I believe, difficult than predicting the future of price of gold. As I have just a limited time, I decided to discuss 5 issues which, from my point of view, are of crucial importance. One, to start with, is the issue of central bank independence. Central bankers, including myself, even before I became a central banker, are convinced that central banks should be independent. And I'll explain in a minute why that is the case. With independence, in my view, comes transparency. So what I will show you in a few minutes is what happened in the past. Not that the past is always a perfect guide for the future, as we know. But still, I think it's useful to learn some lessons from what happened in the past. Then I'll say a few words about monetary policy instruments. Are central banks, even under current circumstances, in a position to deliver what they're supposed to deliver according to their mandates? And then, of course, hard to miss the issue of banking supervision. Not all central banks are responsible for banking supervision, but several, including the Dutch Central Bank, are. And of course, central banks have been severely criticized for screwing up when it comes to banking supervision. And I think rightly so. At the same time, I think central banks are learning their lessons. So quite a bit has changed, and I'll say a few words about that. And then finally, another lesson learned from the crisis is that we have to discuss and we have to implement macro-prudential policies. And again, I'll explain what that is and why it is so important. So this is the outline. So if you want to have a coffee, please go. Why is it so important that a central bank is independent? Well, this quote from The Economist, in my view, says it all. The only good central bank is one that can say no to politicians. The minute politicians get involved in monetary policy making, most of the time, it ends in a disaster. And it's interesting to see that policymakers have learned this lesson, perhaps due to the academic research on this topic, to which I, humble as I be, also contributed. And what this academic research has clearly shown is that there is a very clear relationship between central bank independence and inflation. So if you believe that stable prices is important for money and for the trust people have in our system when it comes to money, then the lesson is make sure that central banks become independent. And this is indeed what happened, which I try to show in this table. What this table shows you is the distribution over time of the level of central bank independence. And this is based on an index which ranges from 0 to 1. And 0 means the lowest possible level of independence, and 1 means the highest level of independence. And as you can see, in the past, and I'm talking here about the 80s, there was no central bank that was extremely independent in the sense that it had an index above 0.8. However, the figures for 2003, and also if you take more recent figures, that's not different, you can see that the number of countries that, according to this index, have a very independent central bank has increased substantially over time. And this not only holds for advanced countries, but also for emerging market and developing countries. So It's clear that the trend in the past has been to increase independence. Having said that independence is important, please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that central banks should decide on their own mandate. It should not be left for the central bank to decide what objectives monetary policy should have. That is something which has to be decided upon by democratically elected politicians. But once that has been settled, it's important that the implementation of monetary policy is left to the central bank, and that politicians do not try to interfere. And currently, there are several indications that politicians, at least in some countries, try to interfere again. Notably in the US. You would not expect perhaps the US that this would happen there, but right now there is a debate in the American Parliament, in Congress, where several proposals are being discussed, which all imply that politicians will have a much greater say about monetary policy making than they currently have. And I think that's a very dangerous development. So I really hope that the US, in this case, in this respect, will be an outlier, and it is not going to be a trendsetter. Because if that happens, my prediction, for what it's worth, will be that monetary policy will not be as good as it used to be. That's not meaning it's perfect, in case you didn't know that. Second issue, central bank transparency. If a central bank is independent, it's important that it's also accountable. Because after all, a central banker is not democratically elected. So it's crucial that central banks are accountable. And accountability starts with being transparent. If it's not clear for everyone what you're doing and why you're doing, there's no way you can be held accountable. So transparency is crucial. And here again, in the recent past, there has been a tremendous increase in transparency levels. Drawing on some academic research, this simple graph shows you the level of transparency, which in this case runs from 0 to 15, and 15 means the highest possible score, in 1998 and 2005. So that means that if a dot is on the red line, it means that the level of transparency of the central banks in both years was the same. And indeed, there are some central banks which are on the red line, which means that they did not increase their transparency over time. But as you can see, most of the dots, and every dot is a central bank, is above the line. And that means that over time, central banks have become much more transparent. At the same time, as you can also see, there's no central bank having the maximum score of 15. Yeah, so, like central bank independence, it's a relative concept. It's not the case that central banks can be fully transparent or can be fully independent. That's not the case. It's about a matter of relative positions.
Which book is the ECB?
That's a very good question, which I cannot answer because I don't know. I don't know. I don't know where the ECB is in this point. If you're interested, send me an email. I can find it out for you. Again, nowadays, the issue of central bank transparency is important. Because the discussion nowadays is, can central banks be too transparent? That's the answer, I guess. Okay. So, we're back. Back in business. Monetary policy instruments, that's the next topic. Because if you want to implement monetary policy with an aim for price stability, then of course you have to be in a position to do so. And in the past, central banks were generally considered to have sufficient instruments that they could, in the end, deliver price stability. And the main instruments, therefore, were short-term monetary policy rates and open market operations. As you all know, nowadays we are in a different world. We are at what is called close to the zero or at the zero lower bound. And that means that policy rates cannot be reduced any further. The zero lower bound, by the way, is not necessarily zero, unlike would suggest otherwise, but there are central banks having negative rates. But it's clear that you can't, reduce interest rates forever. So there's a clear boundary. And that implies that you cannot use your traditional instruments anymore. So central banks all around the world have introduced what is called unconventional monetary policy instruments. That also holds for the ECB, as you know. Not only QE, but before QE, several other unconventional monetary policy instruments were introduced. And even though, we're still in the middle of this period of high uncertainty, I think research, including research I did myself, suggests that monetary policy can be effective even under these extreme circumstances that we face today. That doesn't mean that there are no risks involved. I think the president of the Dutch Central Bank more than once expressed his concern that QE might lead to further bubbles. So there are clear caveats here, but still my conclusion is it can be done. What can't be done, and that is something which also should be very clear, is that monetary policy cannot solve structural problems. Unfortunately, this is what politicians always ask for. Why? Well, because then it's off their back. It's easier if the central bank comes up with stimulatory policies, hoping that thereby the economy will grow faster, instead of doing what is necessary. If you look at the recent monetary policy episodes in Europe, there are several moments during which the ECB intervened, and that at the same time, politicians then thought, okay, now we can relax. Well, if everything is fine, they can relax, but right now we have several structural problems in Europe. By the way, compared to the problems in China, these are minor. China faces much more structural problems than we do, but I don't have time to talk about that. Banking supervision. I think one crucial lesson that we draw from the financial crisis is that we have to do a lot in terms of stronger capital requirements, in terms of stronger liquidity requirements, also when it comes to the organizational structure of banking supervision in Europe. And I think several major steps have been made in this respect. And considering the usually very, very, very slow decision-making process in Europe, it's very remarkable that this single supervisory mechanism, which made the European Central Bank responsible for banking supervision in the euro area, was done in an extremely short time period. I mean, this is really incredible. In general, I was not in favor of granting these powers to the ECB, because I'm in general not always in favor of having banking supervision and within the central bank. But given the fact that it was decided that it should be done quick, there was no other institution than the ECB that could do this. And I think the result so far, again, might be too early to tell, but so far so good. One lesson that the Dutch Central Bank learned was that supervision, financial supervision, should be more than just making sure that banks and other financial institutions meet particular financial requirements. Because financial ratios may suggest that everything is fine. while at the same time, the culture and the conduct within an organization may not be right. And in the end, that will lead, sooner or later, to also financial ratios not being in order. So that's why, and the Dutch Central Bank was the very first central bank in the world to do this, we started 5 years ago with introducing our supervision on behavior and culture of financial institutions. This is really a learning experience. There's no way that you could say, this is the way to do it. So no doubt we made mistakes here as well. But I think so far, the results are very positive, and even so positive that during a conference on Thursday that we had in Amsterdam, the ECB indicated that they are considering to introduce this type of supervision also within the SSM. And I think rightly so. Another important lesson that we draw from the financial crisis is that macroprudential policies are needed. And the main difference between microprudential and macroprudential policies is what are you aiming for? Microprudential policies is directed towards the financial soundness of individual institutions. Macroprudential policies, however, look at the financial system as a whole, because it might look that the financial system is nothing more than an add-up of all the institutions. And if all the financial institutions are sound, according to microprudential supervision, you would be inclined to say, oh, therefore the system will be fine. But that's not the case. If all these financial institutions have, for instance, similar investment policies, and something goes wrong, the entire system will be in trouble. So it's important that you go beyond the individual institution and look at what the entire system it looks like. And this is really a challenge to do this, because this is new. We don't have that much experience. There are some Asian countries that have more experience, and we're looking for that. But in essence, it's really a discovery. We're implementing it. Several central banks use different instruments, and we're learning from one another. But to be honest, it's so new, and there's so many uncertainties involved, that it's very hard to predict how the future will look like. There are many instruments that are currently under debate and sometimes already implemented, but it's a learning experience. So how it will look like in the future, I don't know. But that it will still be an important part of the mandate of the central bank, that for me is not a question. So this is what we are striving for. So removing threats, if unfortunately they will occur, and don't get me wrong, I'm not predicting that there won't be any financial instability in the future, thanks to all our efforts. There will be, but it's crucial that if it happens, that the system will be more resilient. And then if finally something goes wrong, and again, that may happen, then it's important that you have crisis management in order. And again, that's something that we are working on. So let me conclude in view of the time. The future is extremely hard to predict. So this is just my hunch. I'm not saying this is my prediction. But in my view, it's important that no matter what, central banks remain independent and transparent as well. And in my view, they still have sufficient instruments available to fulfill their price stability mandate, also under extreme circumstances. Whether these instruments will be in place when we are back to more quote-unquote normal circumstances, I don't know. Perhaps. What is very sure is that the mandate of central banks will be much more focused on financial stability than they were in the past. And that means not only microprudential, but also macroprudential policies. And again, it's crucial that central banks have instruments to fulfill this part of the mandate as well. And I think they have. So in that sense, I'm very optimistic that the future will be hopefully better in terms of financial stability than the recent past. And that's where I stop. Thank you for your attention.
you very much, Jakob. Let me already give you a lot of wine.
Ooh, thank you.
Yeah. Maybe
Is it cheaper than 25 euros?
I'm not going to say anything about.
Okay.
I'm not that transparent as you are.
Because otherwise I'm not allowed to accept it.
Maybe the first question I have before. I'm sure there's a lot of people have the same question. What do you think personally? So let's just put off the central bank hat. What do you think of Bitcoin and similar currencies or technologies? And then we can go to the audience.
Okay, the reason that I didn't say anything about Bitcoins is very simple. I don't have a clue about Bitcoins. And if you don't believe me, ask Jan Willem. I invited him to come over to the central bank and to enlighten me. And he did his best, but I'm not an expert on Bitcoins. So the only things I can say about Bitcoins and other alternatives in general is that, we closely follow what's happening. We're not, some of you might think that we are fundamentally opposed to these alternatives. We are not. I was talking about myself. There are experts within the central bank who follow closely what happens and who are much better informed than I am. So we closely follow it, and it all depends on what will happen, what our position will be. The only things we have done so far in the recent past, is to publish a DNB bulletin in which we made it very clear that unlike our money, Bitcoins are not under our supervision and are also not guaranteed. So in that sense, it's important, and that's, I think, a lesson or information that we send out, that people understand this. And if they, based on that information, want to get involved, fine.
Mr. De Haan, we are the money, we are the future, we are assets, and we are the capital.
That's good for you. Yes.
We have the ideas, and we
Good.
create the future.
That's why precisely.
Central bank.
No. I just to make sure, I was not saying that I predict the future. I'm not saying that we are the future. Perhaps you are the future. Fine.
Only talk if you have the microphone, please. Otherwise, it's not good for a Dutch next.
Aren't you afraid that the central banks will just lose their control on the monetary system and people will just ignore your fiat, pre-mined, bullshit euro fiat currency?
Well, apparently there are quite a few people who are convinced that they are the future. Let's wait and see. I mean, as I said, I'm not opposed to all these initiatives. And if you're right, indeed the world will be very different and I will lose my job. But by then I will be retired, I guess. Further questions?
Yes, sorry, I'm quite new to this topic, so my question might sound stupid, but I'm very curious to know what is the real difference between the Fed and JP Morgan?
Yeah, this just illustrates that you're indeed quite new. The functions of both are very different, but that's not, of course, what you're alluding to. You're alluding to the fact that there is a kind of a revolving door between Wall Street and the Fed. And yes, when it comes to personality, there are quite a few people who had been in Wall Street and came to the Fed or vice versa. And that might be worrying, for sure, because it might lead to capture. It might lead to the fact that the central bank or the supervisor is too much under the influence of the institutions they're supposed to supervise. And that is something which we are really worried about. You might be surprised that the Dutch Central Bank does research on regulatory capture, but that's what we do. Together with one of my colleagues, we examined to what extent supervisory authorities in the Netherlands are captured in the sense that they are listening too carefully or identify themselves too much with the financial institutions they're supposed to supervise. And there were indications that notably people who are a supervisor, but before they were supervisor, were working in the financial sector, were indeed too much identifying themselves with the financial sector. So that's problematic, for sure. So we are aware of these risks, and we try to minimize them, for one thing, by creating the professional identity of being a supervisor. And that's important, and that helps to indeed, keep your distance, sufficient distance, vis-à-vis the institutions you're supposed to supervise. So these are clearly issues that are important and that we are aware of and that we try to act upon. Does that mean that you should go as far as say, well, never hire anyone who worked in the financial sector before? Well, sometimes you need expertise. We might hire one of you when it comes to the bitcoins or whatever alternative, if we feel that we don't have sufficient expertise. So, yes, I would say in general, try not to hire them, but sometimes you need to. And then, if you need to, be aware of the risks. And that's what we're trying to do. So I hope that answers your question.
Room for one more question?
Ja, ik heb de microfoon.
I'll be here during the break, so if you want to talk in private, that's fine.
Well, I've got the last question for you, or actually to Mr. De Haan. We were listening to your talk, and I heard you say central banks are not capable of solving structural problems in the economy. But the question that popped up into my mind was immediately, what if the institution you're working for is the structural problem we're currently facing?
Well, that's the same answer.
Sorry, that's question one. And question two is,
if we are the problem, we can't solve.
We also heard Mr. Middelkoop give this wonderful speech about the gold standard. And a lot of people in the blogosphere are arguing that we're currently living under a PhD standard, where all the economists in the higher ranks of the central banks are all economists, PhDs.
Or worse, they might be professor.
Or worse, that's even, you could argue that's even worse. But I'm sincerely interested. What makes you think that the people in the central bank who set the policy rates, the interest rates, the amount of money in the economy, that they can know better than all the people in the economy together? Like for instance, we don't know what the price of a car should be. We let the market decide. What would be bad if we let the most important rate in the economy, the price of money, also set in the market instead of a bunch of PhDs getting together in a conference?
That's an interesting question.
But do you also have an interesting answer?
I doubt so. And if I have it, you might not be interested. But no, I think seriously. I think there's a lot of debate, and not for the first time, also in history, about what is the optimal system when it comes to money. And your idea of having competition between banks or even between currencies is not at all that new. There's a famous.
No, I'm not saying it is, but I'm wondering why are you believing in your solution and your instruments and policies?
I'm not a believer.
Which are centralized.
I try to come to conclusions based on arguments. And what I learned from the research on this topic, for instance, about free banking, is that free banking is not a solution when you want price stability. Yeah? Because it didn't work. It's very simple. We tried it, and it didn't work. So, and if it worked, you'd be surprised. But if it worked, I would be the first to say, okay, let's change it. Because the only thing I care about in the end is a monetary system that works to the benefit of all those who are using it. Yeah? And if there's a better system...
But that's not currently the case, in my opinion. Because the current system is to the benefit of Wall Street or the Zuidas, you could say, and not of ordinary folks running a normal company.
I think ordinary people benefit from price stability. And that is the most important mandate for most central banks. And at least for the case of the ECB, that is what the ECB has delivered in the interest of everyone. Yeah, so there I think I disagree with you.
Okay, let's leave it at that. Jakob, again, I know it's not an easy crowd for a central banker. Last year we had an ING speaker. I mean, it's a bunch of anarchist activists, including myself. But so it's.
You should see my old pictures in my young days.
Thank you very much. And,
Dank u wel.